What if the night shift you signed up for never ended? When Christopher Newman accepts a simple security job with strangely high pay, he steps into a facility bound by terrifying rules. Rules that aren't meant to protect him but to trap him. As the hours stretch beyond dawn and his own reflections begin to stalk him, Christopher uncovers a horrifying cycle of copies, rituals, and an ancient machine that feeds on forgotten souls. But in a place where every choice comes at a cost, the question isn't how to survive, it's whether escape is even real. The job posting appeared late one night while I scrolled aimlessly through local listings, trying to convince myself that life hadn't fully collapsed yet. Night shift security, $37.00/HR. No prior experience required, that was the headline. The ad was simple: monitor cameras, secure doors, report any incidents. No mention of company history, no attached documents, just an address and a promise too good to be true. I should have closed the page. Every instinct told me so, but desperation whispers louder than caution when you're broke and behind on rent. Besides, I figured, what could go wrong in one night? I submitted my resume with a shrug, thinking it'd disappear into the void like the dozens before it. But barely an hour later, my phone rang. No caller ID, no number, just a low, staticky connection when I answered. "Is this Christopher Newman?" the voice asked. The man spoke too quickly, as if reading off a script for the first time. His voice was dry, oddly shaky beneath an attempt at authority. "Yes," I said cautiously. "Who's this?" "This is Daniel Edwards," he answered after a long pause. "Human Resources Manager for the company you just applied to." There was another pause. I waited for him to continue, but it hung there like dead air. "And about the application?" I prompted. Yes, of course, we reviewed your information. We'd like you to come in for an interview. Can you be here in 2 hours?" 2 hours. No pre-screening, no background check, no follow-up questions. Just come in. It was either a scam or they needed someone immediately, and if they were that desperate, I might even negotiate a higher pay. Worst case, I'd walk away. I agreed and jotted down the address he gave before he hung up abruptly. I searched the location on Google. Industrial park on the outskirts of town, near the old railway depot. The company had virtually no online presence, aside from a grainy website featuring 2 stern-looking men posing in front of the office building. But no actual business description, no reviews, no social media, nothing. As I drove my rusted 2001 Honda Civic through the gates of the fenced property, my stomach churned. The parking lot was massive, but empty, save for one other vehicle. An old black sedan with tinted windows. The facility itself was large, single-storied, built of concrete and metal with no company name posted on the exterior. The only identifier was the street address on a rusted metal sign. The front door was unlocked. Inside, the reception desk sat unattended, its surface dusty. The overhead lights flickered occasionally, casting harsh white light on the empty lobby. Rows of magazines, long outdated, were scattered across 2 low tables, while 8 chairs sat neatly arranged along the sides of the waiting area. Beyond the lobby, narrow hallways stretched in multiple directions. I stood awkwardly for several minutes before a door creaked open behind me. A short, wiry man rushed in, his dress shirt clinging to his damp skin as he wiped sweat from his brow. His handshake was clammy and brief. "Apologies for the delay, Mr. Newman. I'm Joshua Collins. I manage operations here." His eyes darted constantly, never resting on mine for more than a second. "I spoke with Daniel earlier," I said, testing him. "He said he was HR manager." Joshua blinked quickly, waving it off. Yes. Daniel handles the paperwork remotely now. Things move fast around here." He hurried me into a small office. On the desk sat a stack of papers, several inches thick. A contract. "We're in urgent need of overnight staff. 2 previous guards left this morning unexpectedly, so we need coverage tonight. If you're available to start immediately, you can consider yourself hired." He slid the contract toward me with a pen on top. The pay was indeed $37.00 an hour, The fine print, which I skimmed, included standard non-disclosure agreements, confidentiality about company operations, and clauses preventing litigation for workplace incidents. Typical boilerplate, if unusually forceful in tone. A small voice inside me begged for caution, but my bank account had louder opinions. I signed. "Excellent," Joshua said with visible relief. "Let me give you your access kit." From a drawer, he produced a ring of keys and a slim white booklet with the company's barely legible logo stamped on its cover. "This fob opens the front gate and your office. The second key controls the security shutters on the front glass. This one gives you limited access to the rest of the building. The rule is simple. Stay inside the security office, monitor the feeds, call the emergency line if anything happens. Do not patrol. You'll be safer that way." "Safer?" I repeated, frowning. Joshua avoided my gaze again. "It's mostly precautionary. Sometimes strange people wander near the industrial park at night." His words didn't ease my nerves. My eyes drifted to the white booklet. "And this?" I asked. Joshua's smile faltered. "Ah, yes. Your operational manual. Please read it during your shift. It outlines specific protocols for maintaining safety on site." Before I could question further, he excused himself hurriedly and left the building, disappearing into the night in his black sedan. I was now alone. The building felt heavier in his absence, as though the walls themselves leaned in closer. I locked the front gate behind him, lowered the metal shutters over the glass entrance, secured the office, and finally settled into the security room. The bank of monitors hummed softly, each one showing static-filled views of long hallways, empty storage rooms, and the parking lot I'd just entered. I exhaled and picked up the booklet. The title inside read, "Night Security Protocol, Cadham Facility, Strict Compliance Required." Only one page followed, listing 10 rules, each one stranger than the last. I ran my finger slowly down the list, my throat tightening with each rule. There was no introduction, no explanation, just 10 blunt, chilling instructions. The long hallway beyond the lobby is off limits. If you find yourself past the threshold, walk back immediately. Do not run. Do not stare directly down the long hallway. If the cameras display it, shut them off immediately. Never open the door at the end of the short hallway. Building 2 is off limits. Only observe it through cameras when necessary. If you must leave the security office, use only the front entrance. At exactly 2:01 a.m., the coffee machine will activate automatically. Ensure a cup is placed under it beforehand. Once filled, place the cup outside the security office, lock the door, and do not reopen it until 2:37 a.m. Do not leave the security office between 4:01 and 4:02 a.m. under any circumstance. If you hear a woman's voice from an unknown source, unlock the left door in the short hallway. Do not enter unless invited. Do not look at her face. If you hear a man's voice upon unlocking, return to the security office immediately. If you feel immediate danger, call the emergency number located by the office phone. Do not contact local authorities before sunrise. Do not attempt to leave before dawn. I read the list twice, then a third time. My skin crawled. This couldn't be real. These weren't company protocols. These were survival instructions, ritualistic, ominous, like a set of rules whispered to you in a dream by something ancient and cruel. I wanted to laugh, to dismiss it all as an elaborate initiation prank, but nothing in the building's dead air or Joshua's twitching eyes hinted at humor, and I was locked in now. The old analog clock above the monitors read 9:53 p.m. The night was just beginning. I forced myself to focus on the job, watch the feeds, stay alert. That was the deal. The monitors displayed grainy black and white footage of empty hallways stretching into darkness. The long hallway appeared particularly unsettling on camera, its seemingly endless stretch bordered by closed metal doors, disappearing into a pitch-black vanishing point. My hand hovered over the console, prepared to shut off any feed that lingered too long on that corridor. Midnight passed without incident. Only the hum of the fluorescent lights and the soft whir of the cameras accompanied me. My thoughts wandered between paranoia and boredom, my eyes heavy from the constant static motion on screen. Then, Precisely at 2:01 a.m., a sharp clank startled me. I turned to see the coffee machine, tucked awkwardly into the corner of the room, activating on its own, just like the sixth rule had promised. Thick, dark liquid poured into the cup I had cautiously placed earlier. Its scent, oddly metallic rather than comforting. My nerves stiffened as I carefully picked up the filled cup, cracked open the security office door, placed it gently on the floor just outside, and shut the door tight behind me, locking it as instructed. The air outside the office felt wrong, like the hallway was subtly breathing. I heard faint scraping sounds in the distance, like nails lightly dragging along metal. I sat back at the desk, staring at the locked door. Minutes ticked by with agonizing slowness. 2:23 a.m. The scraping sound stopped. A soft knock tapped at the door behind me. I froze, my spine rigid. 3 soft knocks. Then silence. The rule said nothing about knocks. The silence dragged on until finally the clock hit 2:37 a.m. I exhaled, muscles sore from tension I hadn't realized I'd been holding. I cautiously unlocked the office door and retrieved the now empty coffee cup. Whatever had taken the drink left no trace. No residue, no footprints, nothing. Back inside, I resumed watching the feeds, my pulse still elevated. The cameras flickered, briefly distorting into swirling static before stabilizing again. A shadow moved on the edge of one frame. Far down the long hallway, my stomach clenched. The rule was clear: do not watch the long hallway. I reached out and killed the feed for that camera. Static again, this time on multiple screens. I rotated through them quickly, trying to identify the glitch. Nothing. Then, on camera 6, something else appeared. A figure. At first, I thought it was a trick of the low resolution. The figure stood at the end of a hallway, unmoving, blurry, almost translucent. My breath hitched. It looked like me. Same height, same hair. The figure's head tilted slightly, as though it knew I was watching. I blinked hard and looked again. Gone. The empty hallways stared back. My mouth was dry as I flicked through each remaining feed, checking desperately for movement. The building was still, dead still. I pressed my fingers to my temples. My thoughts spun. Sleep deprivation? Stress? Some cruel hazing attempt? But I knew what I saw. That wasn't imagination. The stillness didn't last. A low electronic hum crackled through the office speakers. It started faint, like distant radio static, then gradually formed into something else. A voice. Female, delicate, whispering words in a language I didn't recognize. Her tone was melodic but grew sharper as she continued, like glass scraping across glass inside my skull. I clutched the edge of the desk, my vision swimming as the whispers wrapped around my mind, invading my thoughts. The rule came rushing back. If you hear a woman's voice, unlock the left door in the short hallway. Do not enter unless invited. The voice pulled at me, like invisible fingers curling into my brain. My legs moved almost on their own. I grabbed the keys, unlocked the security office door, and stumbled into the lobby. The hallway stretched before me. A short hallway this time, ending at a heavy metal door painted dark brown. The word security storage stenciled faintly across its surface. The whispering voice intensified, coaxing me forward. My breathing turned ragged. Every nerve screamed at me to turn back, but I reached the door, unlocking it with trembling hands. The door creaked open. Inside was pitch black, except for a single beam of cold light shining down onto a wooden table. On the far side of the table sat a woman. Her silhouette was vague, like a shadow barely clinging to form. Her head tilted as she raised one hand, palm up, beckoning me to sit across from her. I stepped inside. The moment I sat down, another voice shattered the stillness. A man's voice, harsh, guttural, furious, barked from the shadows behind me. "Don't look at her! Run!" Instinct exploded through me. I bolted from the room, slamming the door shut behind me, my breath ragged and heart hammering as I stumbled back toward the security office. I locked the door behind me and collapsed into the chair. The female whisper was gone. But something far worse was coming. The clock read 3:58 a.m., and I still had hours to survive. The clock's ticking sounded louder now, like it was mocking me. Every second dragged like hours. My breath fogged the glass of the security monitors as I leaned forward, staring hard at the static-filled screens, waiting for something, anything, to happen. And yet, I prayed nothing would. I kept replaying that voice in my head, the woman's whisper, like silk sliding across broken glass. And then the man's urgent, growling command. His words didn't sound like a stranger warning me. They sounded like someone who had seen what happens if you don't run. At exactly 4:00 a.m., the security feeds began to glitch. It started with a simple flicker, then spiraled into full distortion. Wavy lines of static, color bands stretching across the screens like melting film stock. Then suddenly they stabilized. The hallway feed, specifically the long hallway I was ordered never to watch, pulsed onto the center monitor. My stomach dropped. I fumbled for the controls, reaching to shut the feed off before my eyes could absorb too much. But I hesitated. Something moved at the far end, fast, almost too fast to register. It darted forward, then froze halfway down the hall, almost like it was testing my reaction. The figure was large, taller than a man, but wrong. Its proportions didn't add up, like the joints bent at odd angles, its shoulders too broad and its head lolling unnaturally. I slammed the switch, killing the feed. The buzzing in my ears was deafening now. My hands trembled. My breath came in short bursts. Sweat trickled down my back like icy threads. The rules had been clear. Do not stare down the long hallway. The office lights dimmed slightly, as though the building itself exhaled. Then came the scream. It wasn't human. A high-pitched, guttural shriek erupted from somewhere beyond the office walls. The sound vibrated through the metal door, through my teeth, through my chest, like it was trying to rip me apart from the inside. Something massive crashed against the walls outside. The camera feeds, now all blacked out but one, briefly blinked back to life. I watched in horror as the thing hurled itself down the long hallway, slamming against the steel doors like a battering ram, moving erratically, as if its limbs shifted with each impact. It was hunting, and it knew I was watching. I staggered back from the console, gripping the edge of the desk, unable to tear my eyes away from the one remaining camera feed. The creature slowed. Then, disturbingly, it turned. Not physically. There was no graceful pivot. Its entire upper body twisted unnaturally as its head swiveled toward the camera. Toward me. It had no eyes, only smooth, concave patches where they should have been. Its face was slick and stretched, like skin pulled too tight over an incomplete skull. But its mouth was wrong. Wide, human teeth, perfect rows of them, like someone had grafted a smile from a family portrait onto a nightmare. And then it stared. Even without eyes, I could feel it locking onto me. My breathing stopped. I couldn't move. The world narrowed until it was only me and that grotesque, impossible face. The longer it stared, the more my mind rebelled against itself, twisting into knots of primal terror. Something inside me, something older than logic, whispered, "It sees you." Suddenly, the mouth twitched. It smiled wider. My chest seized with cold panic. I slammed the master switch on the console, cutting all feeds to black. The screens hummed faintly, but nothing displayed. I could still hear it outside, though. Its shrieking had shifted into heavy pounding thuds as it charged down another hallway. Then it struck the outer door. Metal groaned under the force. The security door shook against its frame, vibrating with every strike. Paint flakes rained down from the ceiling as the beast hammered against the reinforced barrier, again and again. I crawled backward into the corner of the room, curling my arms around my knees, teeth clenched so hard my jaw ached. The pounding continued, relentless. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The absence of sound was almost worse. My pulse thundered in my ears as I waited for the next impact, but none came. I dared to glance at the wall clock. 4:02 a.m., the same precise moment the rules mentioned. A sick realization settled over me. This thing followed rules too. It played by the schedule, as if obeying some twisted clockwork ritual beyond human understanding. The silence stretched, heavy and uncomfortable. I sat there, paralyzed for nearly 15 minutes, unable to summon the courage to approach the monitors again. Finally, I forced myself upright, inching back toward the console. My hand hovered above the master switch, as if afraid it would trigger something else. When I restored the feeds, the monitors returned to normal. No creature, no movement. The long hallway appeared empty, as if nothing had ever happened, except for one detail. There, at the far edge of the screen, barely noticeable at first, was a smear of dark fluid trailing along the concrete floor. The black streak led from the far door toward the camera before abruptly vanishing off frame. Blood. Or something worse. I stared, hypnotized, until the monitor once again glitched, but this time it didn't return to normal. Instead, something entirely new appeared on screen. A second figure. At first glance, I thought it was a mirror glitch, a video artifact, but the more I looked, the clearer it became. The figure stood at the very edge of camera 4, facing directly toward the lens. A person, my height, my build, the light, wearing my uniform, even mimicking the way I slouched slightly to the side. It was me, or rather, something that looked exactly like me. Its head tilted, its face held no expression, no eyes again, only those smooth hollows, but the mouth stretched into that same grotesque, too widely smile. I blinked hard. When my eyes opened again, it was gone. The camera feed returned to static. For a long while, I didn't move. The room felt colder now, as if the air itself recoiled from whatever had just visited. The clock ticked toward 5:00 a.m. The sky would begin to lighten soon, but I knew this night was far from over. By the time the clock struck 5:00 a.m., my entire body buzzed with exhaustion and dread. I hadn't slept. I didn't dare. Every sound, every flicker of static on the monitors sent fresh jolts of adrenaline through my nerves. I couldn't shake the image of that thing, the perfect imitation of myself, standing silently, smiling, with human teeth under eyeless sockets. The worst part wasn't even its appearance. It was how natural it seemed for it to be there, like it belonged, like it had always been there waiting and I had only just noticed it. The building creaked around me. Somewhere beyond the office, a metallic groan echoed down one of the distant hallways. Pipes settling, maybe? Or not. I didn't trust anything in this place anymore. The monitors continued to flicker between moments of eerie calm and sudden glitch. Occasionally, one camera would freeze entirely for several seconds, then snap back as if nothing had happened. Around 5:15 a.m., camera 6 glitched again. The short hallway leading to the locked side door came into view. But now, something was different. The heavy metal door, the one I had opened earlier when the woman's voice called to me, was slightly ajar. I was sure I had slammed and locked it. I sat frozen, watching the gap. A faint, steady knocking came from somewhere down the hall. Not urgent, not frantic, just consistent. Tap, 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 as if it were waiting patiently for me. I wiped my palms on my pants. My skin was cold, clammy with sweat that refused to dry. Then came the faintest whisper through the office intercom, static breaking around it like brittle glass. "Christopher." The voice was different this time, male, low, gravelly, almost like an imitation of speech rather than actual words spoken aloud. I snapped my head toward the speaker as if expecting to see someone there, but of course, there was nothing. Another knock echoed. The booklet's rules repeated themselves in my mind like a mantra. I was not supposed to respond to voices unless I heard them while unlocking the left door. This wasn't the same situation anymore. This was something else entirely. A test, maybe. A trap. My eyes flicked to the office clock again. 5:23 a.m. Just over 3 hours left. The knocking stopped, and then the entire building shifted, like something heavy had moved inside its walls. Camera 8 blinked on momentarily. I watched in disbelief as its feed showed an area of the building that wasn't supposed to exist, an extension of the hallway I didn't recognize. The floor was stained, the walls streaked with black grime. At the far end stood a new door, completely unfamiliar, sealed with thick metal bolts. I fumbled through the pages of the protocol booklet again, desperately searching for any mention of this space. Nothing. The intercom crackled once more, and this time several voices overlapped. First the woman's soft cooing from before, then a second deeper voice, rasping, inhuman. "You shouldn't be here." The overlapping whispers created a nauseating pressure in my ears. My hands trembled as I reached for the office phone, desperate for a connection. I dialed the emergency number listed on the bright red sticker beside the handset. The line rang. Once, twice, then someone picked up. "Yes?" The voice on the other end was disturbingly calm. "Daniel Edwards speaking." It was the same man from the initial phone call, the man who'd barely spoken during my rushed hiring process. "There's something in the building," I said quickly. "Something is wrong. The cameras." "I know," Daniel interrupted, voice flat. "It happens every night." I froze. "You? No?" "We monitor the situation remotely," he continued. "The event patterns are predictable. The entity will leave once the cycle completes." "What the hell is this place?" I demanded, voice cracking under the weight of panic rising in my chest. "What are those things?" Daniel sighed as if annoyed by the question. "The containment system works as long as the rules are followed. That's all you need to understand." "But it saw me," I whispered. "It saw me, and it made another me." There was a pause. "Did it make contact?" he asked finally. "No, not yet." Another pause, a longer one. "Then, you're still safe. For now." And then he hung up. The line went dead. I slammed the phone back onto its cradle, breathing heavily, my heart racing. For several seconds I stared at the blank receiver, as if hoping it might ring again. But it didn't. The building groaned once more. I turned back to the monitors, just as camera 4 lit up unexpectedly. A figure stood directly in front of the camera, its face impossibly close to the lens. The smile was wider this time, stretching unnaturally toward its ears. The eyeless sockets gaped like empty wells. As I stared, frozen in place, its head tilted further, like it was analyzing me through the screen. The screen pulsed faintly, almost breathing. Then the feed cut to black. I couldn't breathe. The lights above flickered, the walls seemed to close in. I tried to ground myself. I whispered the rules aloud, again and again, as if repeating them might serve as protection. Do not stare at the long hallway. Do not open the wrong doors. Do not leave before dawn. Outside the office, something scraped softly across the concrete. The minutes dragged. At 5:47 a.m., the intercom burst to life one last time. "Almost dawn," the female voice sang sweetly. "But you won't make it." The lights dimmed once again, and then, just for a moment, I heard my own voice echo back through the speaker. "But you're already here." The sun should have risen by now. That was the first thought that cut through my exhaustion-soaked mind as I stared at the flickering office clock. 5:59. IOM. The sky outside the security shutters remained oppressively dark. No faint glow on the horizon, no hint of morning. Only an endless black pressing against the building. Time had stopped. Or perhaps it was being held hostage. The air inside the security office grew thicker, heavier, like something unseen was pushing against the walls. My head pounded, my eyes stung. My body begged for rest, but terror wouldn't let me close my eyes. The monitors glitched again, but this time it wasn't static. The long hallway appeared on the center screen. Its familiar endless stretch, but now a strange fog crept along the floor. The mist swirled unnaturally, as if it was alive, breathing, coiling like fingers reaching out into the dark. I quickly shut the feed off. The rules were very clear. Do not stare at the long hallway. I clung to those rules like a lifeline. The only thing that had kept me alive this long. But something was different now. The intercom clicked softly, then buzzed with faint static. A voice emerged, soft at first, like a whisper from across a vast distance. "Christopher!" It was my voice. No distortion, no mimicry. It was me, speaking from somewhere else inside the building. And yet, I hadn't spoken. The blood drained from my face. My fingers instinctively gripped the edge of the desk to keep myself grounded. "You're almost there," my voice continued, warmer now, almost comforting. "It's okay. Just one more step." I shut off the intercom entirely, pulling its cord from the wall. But the voice didn't stop. It wasn't coming from the speaker anymore. It was inside my head. "You've done so well." I pressed my palms against my temples, teeth clenched, willing the words to stop echoing inside my skull. And then, something worse. On monitor 6, the short hallway feed came back online. The heavy security storage door, the one I had barely survived opening earlier, was now wide open. The chair inside the room sat pulled away from the table. Empty. No woman, no figure beckoning, no voice inviting me in. But on the wall behind the table, scrawled in black, dripping streaks, were words I hadn't seen before. "He is coming." The message pulsed like it was still wet, the black liquid writhing slightly under the dim lighting. My stomach twisted, my mouth filled with bile. I swallowed hard and forced my shaking hands to rotate through the other cameras. That's when I saw him. On camera 4, the long hallway again. A figure now walked slowly toward the camera. Not darting, not lunging like before. Slow, deliberate. I recognized the gait instantly. It was me. Again, the false reflection. Its shoulders slumped, just like mine. The slight limp from an old knee injury. The exact curve of my spine, a flawless copy of every detail, except for one thing, that face. The eyeless sockets were deeper now, almost cavernous, with dark fluid streaking down its cheeks like black tears. The mouth stretched wider than before, curling into an almost gleeful grin. As it drew closer, the camera glitched heavily, struggling to keep focus, but somehow it always stabilized just enough to let me see its face. And then the copy did something new. It raised its hand and waved, a slow, calm wave, as if greeting me. I wanted to vomit. I cut the feed again, plunging the screens into static-filled darkness, but I knew it was still coming. I could feel it. The walls groaned under invisible weight. The air pressure shifted, forcing my ears to pop painfully. A dull, rhythmic thump began, soft at first, but building steadily. Footsteps outside my office. The hallway beyond the locked steel door had fallen silent for most of the night, but now it paced back and forth, the cadence almost human, measured, calculated. I sat paralyzed, listening. Left, right, pause. Left, right, pause. Like it was waiting for me to lose patience, to open the door. I pulled my chair as far from the door as I could, huddled into the farthest corner, my breathing shallow. The minutes dragged. The clock ticked past 6:15 a.m. and still no dawn. That's when something truly terrifying happened. The lights in the office flickered, and suddenly, the power to the security door controls cut off entirely. A loud metallic clank echoed as the lock disengaged. The door was no longer secured. My chest seized. The rules hadn't prepared me for this. I didn't move. I barely breathed. The footsteps stopped. I waited, heart hammering against my ribs like it wanted to break free. The handle on the door twitched, once, then again. Slowly, the heavy metal door creaked open just a few inches, revealing nothing but pure black on the other side. I couldn't see it, but I knew it was standing there, waiting. The temperature dropped several degrees. My breath became visible as short puffs of condensation. Then it spoke, not aloud, but inside my head like before. Only now, it wasn't mimicking my voice anymore. It was something deeper, older. "You've seen too much, Christopher." The words crawled into my thoughts like worms burrowing into soft flesh. "You're not supposed to remember." I clenched my eyes shut. whispering the rules over and over, like a prayer. But the voice only grew louder. "We can't let you leave." The door creaked wider. I still refused to look directly at it. Then, another voice, the female one from earlier, cut through the mental storm. "Stay inside. Don't look. Don't invite it." And suddenly the door slammed shut, as though some unseen force had yanked it closed. The locks re-engaged on their own. The air pressure released, and I gasped for breath, my body trembling violently. I collapsed to the floor, sobbing with relief and confusion, barely holding on to what little sanity remained. The clock blinked. 6:32 a.m. Still no sunrise. Still trapped. But for now, the door was closed, and I was still alive. The minutes after the door slammed shut passed in a haze of shallow breaths and frantic whispers. My back pressed flat against the cold cement wall, knees tucked into my chest like a child hiding from some primal monster under the bed. But this monster wasn't under my bed. It was right outside the goddamn door. The rules had saved me again, or something, or someone had. That female voice, I couldn't tell if she was protecting me or luring me deeper into this nightmare. Either way, for now, I was alive. The clock blinked. 6:43 a.m. Still no dawn. The monitors remained off. I didn't dare turn them back on. Seeing nothing was better than risking another glimpse of that thing. That version of me. Instead, my gaze fell back to the white booklet sitting on the desk. I hadn't opened it since my first reading. My fingers trembled as I flipped through its thin pages again, hoping I'd missed something, some clue, some loophole, but there was nothing new. No updates, no secret instructions, just those same 10 commandments, my fragile lifeline in a place that didn't follow any natural law. A part of me wondered who wrote these rules, who had seen enough of this nightmare to lay down this framework for survival, and how many others had failed. The thought made my skin crawl. The room hummed again, a low, barely audible vibration in the walls that made my teeth ache. Suddenly, the intercom sparked back to life, on its own, despite being unplugged. A distorted voice crackled through the static, low and mechanical, as though multiple voices were layered on top of one another, creating something deeply unnatural. Cycle. Incomplete. The words repeated 3 times, then fell into harsh static before cutting out entirely. Cycle. My blood ran cold. Was this all some kind of loop? A system that reset night after night? Was that why the rules existed? To manage the repetition of something unspeakable? Or worse, was I trapped inside it now? A faint clicking sound snapped my attention toward the hallway again. The door remained closed, but something was scratching lightly at its surface. Not violently, not urgently, just testing. Scrape, pause, scrape, like fingernails tracing patterns across steel. Then, without warning, all 8 monitors flared back to life. I jumped to my feet instinctively, heart pounding in my throat, but the screens showed no immediate movement. The hallways were empty. The storage room door was closed again, but one camera stood out. Camera 7. The image it displayed was wrong. Completely wrong. It wasn't a hallway or storage room. It wasn't any part of the building I recognized. It was a wide, circular chamber with concrete walls, dimly lit by exposed bulbs swinging gently from unseen air currents. The floor was stained, covered in crude markings, symbols I didn't recognize, drawn in thick, oily black lines that pulsed like veins. In the center of the room stood an old wooden chair. Shackles dangled from its arms and legs. There was no door in this chamber, no windows, no entrance, just the chair. I stared, unable to tear my eyes away. How was the camera even filming this? Then, as if in answer, a shadow slipped across the feed, something massive lurking just out of frame. The camera's focus twitched, trying desperately to adjust, but whatever the shadow was, it refused to fully reveal itself. I whispered aloud, my voice cracking, "What the hell is this place?" As if hearing me, the female voice returned. "You've been here before. The words rang out from nowhere, yet filled the entire room. My skin broke into goosebumps. "No," I whispered instinctively. "That's not true." But even as I spoke, a strange pressure built inside my skull, like memories trying to claw their way out of a locked room inside my mind. Flashes, bits of color, sounds, a chair, chains, screaming. Not mine, someone else's. I stumbled back, my knees buckling slightly. My vision blurred as the images invaded my head. Another voice, the male one, roared through my skull. "You don't belong outside!" The monitors glitched again. When they cleared, the hallway feeds displayed something I hadn't seen before. People. At first glance, they looked like staff, security guards like me. But something was off. Their movements were stiff, jerky, like puppets on invisible strings, their heads tilted at impossible angles as they wandered the empty corridors, and every single one of them looked just like me. Dozens of versions of myself walking aimlessly through the building, mimicking routines, pacing the same paths over and over like broken loops of forgotten lives. My stomach twisted violently. This place wasn't hiring security, it was collecting replacements. A sickening truth began to crystallize in my mind. What if I wasn't the first Christopher Newman to take this job? What if there had never been just one of me here? The sound of footsteps interrupted my spiraling thoughts, heavier this time, slower, deliberate. Outside the security office door, something was standing there again. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The handle jiggled softly, and then a voice spoke from behind the door, this time perfectly replicating my voice, down to every inflection and breath. "Chris," it whispered, "it's me. It's safe now. You can open the door." My legs trembled. "No," I whispered back, barely audible. The thing outside chuckled, my chuckle, the same way I laughed nervously on that first awkward phone call with Daniel. "You have to let me in," it purred. "We can't both stay." The words hit me like a slap across the face. We can't both stay. The rules never said anything about replacements. My hands clenched into fists as the realization burned through me. This wasn't about surviving the night. This was about taking someone's place. The door handle stopped moving. Silence returned. And then, without warning, the voice changed. It deepened, warping into that same grotesque ancient rasp from earlier. "You will break." The voice dissolved into harsh, static laughter that filled the air like smoke. I sank to my knees, pressing my hands over my ears, trying to block it out, but the sound vibrated straight through my bones. The laughter only grew louder. And then, finally, it stopped. The silence afterward was deafening. The clock read 6:59 a.m., 1 minute to dawn, if dawn was ever coming. The clock struck 7:00 a.m., and nothing changed. No sunrise, no warm orange glow slipping through the cracks of the metal shutters, just more black. As if morning had simply forgotten this place existed. I sat against the cold wall, barely able to move. My legs were numb, my mind floating somewhere between exhaustion and hysteria. I had made it to dawn, or what should have been dawn, but the night refused to end. The cycle wasn't complete. Not yet. The intercom, still disconnected, crackled alive once more. "You're close," the woman's voice whispered, "but not safe." My throat burned. I didn't respond. There was no one left to respond to. The monitors flickered again, but this time they didn't cycle through random static or hallway feeds. Instead, every screen displayed a single, synchronized image. The same chair in that strange circular chamber. The same shackles. The same symbols pulsing faintly like breathing wounds on concrete. Only now, someone was sitting in the chair. I couldn't breathe. The person was slumped forward, bound tightly at the wrists and ankles. His head hung limp, chin resting on his chest, face obscured by tangled dark hair. But I recognized the shape of him instantly. It was me. Another copy, or maybe the original. The air thickened with nausea as my mind raced. How many of me existed in this building? How long had this loop been running? Was I the first, The last? Or just another temporary replacement before someone or something reset the cycle once more? My thoughts fractured under the weight of it, and then the head on the screen snapped up sharply. Its face turned to the camera, eyeless. Its skin stretched taut like wax melting under heat, and its mouth curled into that impossible smile, rows of perfect human teeth gleaming in the dim light. I stumbled away from the monitors, knocking the chair over as I collapsed against the opposite wall. My breathing came in short, violent gasps. The room spun around me. The intercom pulsed again, this time louder. The woman's voice was calm, almost soothing. "You must finish what began," she whispered. "You left before. You broke the ritual. You must return." I shook my head violently, clawing at my scalp as if I could rip the words out of my brain. "No," I whispered through clenched teeth. "I've never been here before. This is my first night." The voice hummed with a gentle amusement. "Is it?" Suddenly, the lights overhead dimmed. The hum of the fluorescent bulbs weakened as the air itself seemed to compress inward. A low rumble echoed through the building like distant thunder, rolling through unseen tunnels. Then came the pounding. Heavy, deliberate strikes against the outer walls. The same creature or creatures were back. Or perhaps they had never left. The cameras switched feeds again. Hallway after hallway now displayed movement. The puppets, dozens of them, all identical to me, all pacing in perfect synchronization, heads tilting and twitching as if guided by invisible strings. Their mouths all smiled. They were everywhere now. Camera 6 revealed that the storage room door had reopened, its interior bathed in faint, pulsating light. The symbols on the walls inside had shifted, rearranged into new shapes, like they were rewriting themselves. I could feel the pull, a pressure behind my eyes, a compulsion to leave the safety of the office and return to that room, to sit in the chair. The female voice returned. "You cannot leave until balance is restored." I screamed into the empty room, my voice cracking under the strain. "What balance? What are you? What is this place?" There was no immediate answer, only that omnipresent hum, vibrating in my bones like a chorus of unseen voices singing in unison just beyond the veil of reality. The rules had always been clear, and yet now I understood that following them wasn't about survival. It was about containment. They weren't written for me. They were written for them, to keep them locked inside, and something was failing. The building shuddered again. On camera 3, I watched as the hallway shutters, a second layer of steel barriers I hadn't even realized existed, began to retract upward on their own, exposing the endless black behind the glass windows. The void outside wasn't night anymore. It was emptiness, as if the building had been floating in a pocket dimension all along. A prison. The monitors blinked. All feeds returned to that same circular chamber. This time, the chair was empty again. I held my breath. Then, from the very top of the frame, a shape slowly descended into view. A head, lowered by unseen force, dangling from taut ropes of skin or sinew, its neck twisted unnaturally as it turned toward the camera. Its face was almost, but not quite, mine. The eyes were wrong. They weren't absent now. They were hollow, but filled with movement, a swirling blackness inside like a nest of worms writhing beneath glass. The mouth opened wide, wider than should have been possible. It whispered a single word directly into my skull. Switch. The power in the office cut out completely. I was plunged into total darkness. My breath echoed loudly inside the confined space. My heart slammed against my ribs, each beat deafening. I stayed perfectly still, eyes wide, listening for any sound, any hint that something was inside the room with me now. Then, the faintest scrape behind me. The office door creaked open. Something had entered. I didn't turn. I couldn't. Instead, I whispered the only words left to anchor myself. "Do not leave before dawn." And yet, I knew dawn might never come. Not here. Not for me. The darkness inside the office was absolute, not the kind of darkness where you wait for your eyes to adjust. This was something else, a suffocating absence, heavy and thick, like a weight pressing on my skin. The scrape behind me came again, closer. I couldn't move. Every instinct screamed to run, to turn, to fight. Something stronger anchored me where I sat, an understanding that if I turned to face it, I wouldn't see a monster, I would see myself. The floor beneath me pulsed faintly, almost like a heartbeat in the concrete itself. The building was alive, or rather, the thing that controlled it was breathing through its walls, through its systems, through me. Then, softly, a whisper, directly into my right ear. "You're ready?" My jaw clenched. "No," I croaked, my throat raw and dry. "I'm not." "But you were always meant to return," the voice said gently, as if comforting a child refusing sleep. "That's why we called you back." "I've never been here before." "You've always been here." The scraping stopped. The silence that followed was worse. It stretched unnaturally long, bending time like elastic. The pressure inside my skull increased. The building creaked, its metal skeleton groaning as the walls seemed to shift, subtly changing shape as if pulling tighter around me. I risked a glance toward the monitors, but the power remained out, nothing but cold black screens reflecting faint silhouettes. Then, without warning, the monitors flared to life, flickering violently. Static bled into vague shapes. Images layered over one another in rapid, nauseating succession. The chair, the long hallway, the circular chamber, the many versions of myself. All superimposed, cycling faster and faster until the frames almost blended into one. My head throbbed. I shut my eyes, but even behind closed lids, the images kept flashing. A memory surfaced. Or maybe it wasn't a memory. Maybe it was implanted, fabricated, but it felt real. I was strapped to that chair, the cold metal biting into my wrists. A voice chanting in the distance, too distorted to understand. The symbols on the floor pulsing under my feet. I remembered screaming. And then, nothing. Had I died here before? Was I simply one of many copies, waking into a cycle I'd already failed once? The monitors hissed sharply. Then a new feed appeared, a camera angle I hadn't seen before, looking directly into the security office I was sitting in. There I was, sitting exactly where I sat. Only, it wasn't me. The figure on the screen moved, raising its head slowly, and stared directly into the lens, eyeless, smiling. Its mouth moved without sound, but somehow I heard the words, as if they were being transmitted directly into my mind. "Let me in." I flinched backward, slamming into the wall. The office door behind me groaned slightly as if responding to the command. My gaze darted toward the handle, watching it quiver gently as if under pressure from the other side. I pressed my back harder into the cold wall, gripping the floor, repeating the rules under my breath like a prayer. Don't open the door. Don't leave before dawn. Don't look at it. The temperature in the room dropped sharply. My breath became visible, curling in front of my face like tendrils of mist. My fingers ached from the cold. The whisper returned. "This is mercy, Christopher. We don't take you. You offer yourself." I clenched my teeth. No. A deep guttural laugh vibrated through the walls. "All who work here eventually choose." The voice continued. "You all find your way to the chair." The monitor switched feeds again. Now the hallway appeared empty, but not quite. Far in the distance, barely visible in the fog that had crept back inside, was another figure, slowly making its way toward the security office. Its movements were unnatural, stuttered, as though reality struggled to render its existence properly. It was getting closer. Every few steps it paused, jerking unnaturally to the side before correcting itself, as if something inside it was trying to break free from the imitation. When it reached the final stretch of hallway directly outside the office, it stopped. I could hear its breathing now, raspy and wet, as though lungs never designed to function were forcing themselves to imitate life. The intercom buzzed again. The female voice returned, quieter than before, but more desperate. "Don't open the door, Christopher. It's not ready yet." Not yet. My mind spiraled. Not ready yet? What was it waiting for? The door handle jerked sharply. Once. Twice. It was losing patience. I shut my eyes, gripping my knees tightly, rocking slightly as I whispered aloud, "Don't open. Don't open. Don't open." Then, everything stopped. The handle froze. The breathing ceased. The humming inside the walls faded into nothing, and for a brief moment, I allowed myself to believe it might finally be over. That was a mistake. The lights overhead burst back on, flooding the room with sharp white fluorescence. The monitors returned to full functionality, displaying all hallways. But now every screen showed a different version of me. Each walking aimlessly, each smiling, each lost in their own identical loop. The building had become a prison of copies. Each one a failed attempt at escape, wandering endlessly, reliving my steps over and over. And they were multiplying. The newest one, the one that had tried my door, was now walking calmly down the long hallway on camera 1, blending into the others as if it had always been there. I stared at the screens, breathless, paralyzed by the realization there wasn't just one of me trapped here. There were hundreds, thousands, and still the cycle hadn't stopped. The intercom buzzed one last time. Daniel's voice came through, now flat, emotionless. "Your shift will be extended." I wanted to scream, but nothing came out. The monitors dimmed to black again. The clock blinked. 8:03 a.m. No sun, no exit. Just another night, resetting, and I was still inside. The concept of time had become meaningless. The clock on the wall ticked forward, but it was lying to me. Hours stretched and twisted, folding in on themselves while the darkness outside the steel shutters remained impenetrable. There was no dawn here. Only the loop, only the cycle, only me, and the copies. I don't know how long I sat there after Daniel's final message. "Your shift will be extended." The words rang like a death sentence, or worse, like an acceptance into something far older, far deeper than a simple night shift job. But as the hum of the building settled into its unnatural silence again, something shifted. The monitors blinked once more. For the first time since this nightmare began, they displayed something new. On camera 4, the long hallway, the fog had cleared. The far end, which had always been swallowed in darkness, was now illuminated by a pale, unnatural glow. At the very end of the corridor, an elevator door stood slightly ajar. I'd never seen an elevator here before. The camera's angle zoomed in by itself, pulling me into its frame. And there, inside the crack of the elevator doors, a hand emerged. It was unmistakably my hand. It twitched slightly, as though trying to reach for something just out of sight. A chill spidered up my spine. The female voice returned, no intercom this time. Just the voice inside my head. "You're close." I wanted to scream at it, to demand answers, but I was past bargaining. My options were vanishing one by one. Then, for the first time since this hell began, the security office door slowly unlocked on its own. Click. The metal bolt retracted. The heavy door creaked open an inch, inviting me out. The rules had always told me to stay inside. But the rules were never designed for escape. They were designed for control. I hesitated for long seconds, my fingers trembling as I stared at the slightly open door. I could feel the cold air leaking in from the hallway. It carried something with it. Not quite a smell, but a presence. Something ancient and watching. "You must choose," the woman's voice urged softly. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. I rose slowly, my legs numb beneath me. My vision swam as I stepped forward, placing one hand on the cold steel door, pushing it wider. The hallway outside was empty. For the first time, truly empty. No puppets, no shadows, no shifting copies of myself waiting in the corners of my vision. just the endless stretch of cold concrete leading toward the far hallway intersection and toward the faint glow of that open elevator. Every step echoed unnaturally as I moved forward. My breaths came ragged, each exhale forming short, wispy clouds in front of my face. The temperature was dropping with every footfall. The further I walked, the less real the building felt, like its edges were starting to fray, losing cohesion. The rules had been my anchor. Now that I had broken them, the world inside this place seemed to resist my existence. I passed the reception desk. The same magazines still sitting there, frozen in time. The thin layer of dust covered them, though I knew I'd seen Joshua place them fresh on my first day. Had it even been my first day? I couldn't tell anymore. As I reached the intersection, my eyes locked on the elevator at the end of the long hallway. The doors were open just enough to reveal the faint golden light inside, pulsating softly. It felt like a lure, like a trap baited specifically for me. I should have turned back. I should have locked myself inside the office again and prayed to whatever forces governed this place that I'd survive one more loop, but instead, I kept walking. Because deep inside, I knew something now. The loop wouldn't let me survive forever, and the longer I stayed inside it, the closer I would come to becoming one of those wandering copies, hollowed out, lost in endless repetition, smiling without eyes. No, if this was my way out, or my end, I had to face it. The air thickened as I approached the elevator. My ears popped from the pressure. My skin burned cold. The soft hum emanating from behind the doors pulsed with an almost living rhythm. And then, softly, I heard something I didn't expect. A child. Crying. Faint, but clear. Coming from inside the elevator. The hairs on my arms stood up. Every muscle in my body screamed to retreat, to run, to escape whatever waited inside that chamber. But my feet kept moving forward. I reached out with a shaking hand and pried the doors open wider. What I saw inside nearly buckled my knees. The elevator wasn't an elevator at all. It was another room, circular like the chamber I had seen before on the monitors. Symbols carved into the floor pulsed, softly, alive, under some invisible force. In the center stood the familiar wooden chair, shackles dangling open and inviting, and sitting inside the chair was me, or what used to be me. The version of me inside the chair looked emaciated, pale, its skin stretched thin over sharp bones. The face was sunken and hollow, the eyes reduced to black pits swirling with that familiar movement, like thousands of tiny threads twisting together. But the mouth was frozen in that wide, impossible smile. It was not dead. Its head twitched violently when it sensed my presence. The body spasmed against its restraints. Then, the child's voice spoke again. But this time, it wasn't a child at all. It was using my voice. "Christopher, help me, let me out!" I stumbled back, bile rising in my throat. The voice repeated, more desperate, more distorted. "Help me! Help me! Help me!" The chair shook with violent spasms, the creature's head jerking back unnaturally as its voice fractured into multiple overlapping pitches. The symbols beneath the chair pulsed brighter, responding to its frenzy. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream. Instead, I whispered under my breath, my voice trembling. "What? Are you?" The thing inside the chair stopped thrashing. It lifted its head slowly, almost peacefully now, and with perfect clarity, using my exact voice, it answered, "I'm what you left behind." The words settled into my skull like sharp glass, slicing through every rational thought I had left. "I'm what you left behind." The thing inside the chair didn't move after speaking. Its head lolled slightly, as though its brittle neck barely held the weight of the skull. The black pits where eyes should have been seemed deeper now, pulling light into themselves. It was me, and not me. My pulse hammered, my breath came shallow, almost ragged. The compulsion to turn and flee clawed at my gut, but my legs wouldn't obey. My feet remained frozen to the floor, like the building itself held me captive. The childlike voice returned, softer now, whispering from somewhere inside the chamber rather than from the creature directly. "You forgot, Christopher." The air grew denser. My ears popped again, followed by a pressure behind my eyes like a migraine blooming far too quickly. "You broke the cycle before," the voice cooed, "but not completely. You ran before you were ready, and now you've come back to finish it." I clenched my teeth, forcing words out through the panic. "What is this place? What are you?" A shudder rippled through the chair. The thing's smile widened. Its jaw stretched just slightly too far, like its skin was nothing more than plastic being pulled thin. "You called us." The words hit harder than any scream. No, I didn't." The female voice, the one that had guided me earlier, cut back in. But this time, it wasn't gentle. It was colder, firmer, like an unseen hand gripping my spine. "You don't remember, because you asked to forget." The chamber vibrated, as though reacting to her words. The lights overhead pulsed in rhythmic surges, matching the symbols carved into the floor, which glowed hotter and hotter. "Years ago," the woman continued, her voice wrapping around me like ice, "you sat in that chair. You begged for release. You traded your memory to escape, but the debt remained unpaid." The symbols at my feet crawled toward me like ink seeping across the concrete, forming patterns I couldn't comprehend. I stumbled backward, but there was no place to retreat. The elevator shaft behind me no longer existed. The walls had sealed themselves, leaving only this room, me, the chair, and the thing occupying it. "You promised us another," the voice whispered. The thing in the chair jerked upright again, as if electrified by her words. Its head twisted toward me at a nauseating angle. "You," the copies, the endless versions of me wandering the hall. They weren't victims. They were offerings, failed trades, empty vessels recycled into the machine that kept this nightmare breathing. I shook my head furiously, rage bubbling beneath the terror. "I never agreed to this," I spat. "You did." Both voices answered in unison. My vision blurred again, but this time flashes of memories I didn't know I had clawed their way to the surface. The job application, but not recent. Older. Years older. Me sitting at a desk, desperate, broken. A man. Daniel, sitting across from me, offering not a job but a contract. One night, I had whispered back then. Just one night if you can erase the rest. The contract had no ink, only a shallow cut across my palm pressed to an ancient seal. "You chose to forget, and you chose to return," the woman repeated now. The realization stabbed deeper than any blade. I had done this before. I was not the first Christopher Newman. I was the same Christopher Newman, over and over again. The cycle wasn't creating copies. It was returning me to finish what I had started. The thing inside the chair strained against its restraints, the shackles rattling louder now. The veins pulsing beneath its paper-thin skin darkened, spreading like poison through its body. "You cannot leave unfinished," it rasped. "You cannot leave incomplete." Suddenly, the chamber shook violently, as though something massive struck the outer walls of the facility. The lights flickered wildly. The symbols beneath us glowed white-hot now, forming what looked like concentric circles spiraling toward the chair and toward me. The floor beneath my feet cracked. Thin fractures spread outward like a spiderweb, pulsing with each heartbeat. The air began to spin. A vortex forming in the center of the chamber, pulling loose dust and debris into a tight spiral around the creature. "You must take your place," the voice screamed, no longer kind, no longer calm. The creature's smile collapsed into something grotesque, its jaw unhinged fully, its entire face splitting as if the skin itself couldn't contain the thing inside anymore. Rows of teeth, far too many, far too sharp, spiraled inward toward a void of absolute black, and it was reaching for me now. Not physically, but something behind my eyes, pulling, twisting, trying to unravel my identity from within. I screamed, clutching my head. "No!" The female voice returned sharply, but now from directly behind me. no longer distant, no longer whispering. "You have one final choice, Christopher." I spun wildly but saw no one, only shadows clinging to the edges of the chamber. "Take your place in the chair." Her voice paused, then lowered to a whisper, "or break the cycle." The creature lunged forward, pulling against the chains, the shackles snapping one by one. Its voice joined hers now, louder, more desperate. "Join us!" The spinning vortex intensified. The cymbals cracked beneath my feet. The weight pressing against my mind nearly crushed me. But beneath it all, a single thought fought its way to the surface. Defiant, simple. I am not ready to disappear. With the last ounce of control I had left, I reached for the only thing still real to me. The security badge hanging from my chest, still cold, still solid, still mine. I ripped it from my neck and slammed it down into the center of the symbol at my feet. The floor erupted in a blast of light. The vortex shattered. The creature shrieked, not just from its mouth, but from within the very walls, as though the entire building screamed along with it. The world convulsed. And then, silence. Absolute suffocating silence. The lights flickered weakly above me. The symbols faded from the floor like spilled ink drying into nothing. The creature inside the chair slumped forward, motionless, no longer breathing. The spiraling teeth vanished, replaced once again by the hollow mimic of my face, but this time frozen, lifeless. The elevator doors behind me reopened, and for the first time I saw something different outside. A faint gray light. Dawn. The gray light bled through the elevator doors like a hesitant promise. It wasn't the golden warmth of a sunrise. It was pale, distant. More like the world outside was remembering it was supposed to exist again. My body refused to believe it. For endless hours, no, days, I'd been locked in that twisted loop where reality bent and time spiraled into itself. Now, standing at the threshold of the elevator, my mind battled with the simple question: was this real? The creature inside the chair no longer moved. It hung limp, defeated, or perhaps waiting. Its face, still disturbingly my own, stared at nothing. The swirling void behind its hollow eyes had vanished, leaving behind only pits of black emptiness. I kept waiting for it to lurch back to life. It didn't. The room pulsed softly, like the final fading breaths of some enormous machine winding down. I stepped toward the open elevator. The moment my foot crossed the threshold, a strange sensation filled my chest. Not pain, not fear. It was release. As though an invisible thread tethered to my spine had finally been cut. The walls around me shifted gently, the symbols along the chamber floor dulling to ash, crumbling like forgotten chalk lines. The door behind me sealed shut. The elevator hummed softly, then began to rise. For the first time since entering this place, I was moving vertically. The oppressive underground concrete that had wrapped around me like a tomb now fell away, floor by floor. The groaning of mechanical cables echoing softly in the shaft. There were no numbers, no indicator of how far I was traveling, only the soft buzz of motion and my shallow breathing. And then the voice returned. Not Daniel's, not the creature's, hers. "You broke the cycle," she whispered gently, "but not the chain." My fists clenched at my sides. "Who are you?" My voice was hoarse. "Why did you do this to me?" A brief silence hung, and then she spoke again, her tone softer, almost sympathetic now. "You called us," she said, echoing that sickening truth again. "You were lost, broken. You came willingly. You begged to forget your sins." The elevator slowed. My stomach twisted, anticipating what would greet me above. "I don't remember," I said through gritted teeth. "You weren't meant to. That was your price." The elevator shuddered to a halt. The doors slid open slowly, and there it was. The surface. But not the surface I remembered. The parking lot, the building exterior, all gone. Instead, I stood at the edge of a vast open plain under an endless overcast sky, stretching far in every direction like a world that had been emptied out long ago. Thin, jagged trees twisted up like black veins from the cracked earth, their branches clawing toward the colorless sky. In the distance stood the facility, but altered. The building I had entered on my first night was now half sunken into the ground, its structure broken and decaying, as though abandoned for decades. The front sign, once polished steel, now hung crooked, rusted beyond recognition. It looked ancient, forgotten. The wind cut across the plain, carrying with it distant whispers I couldn't decipher. The air smelled different, stale, hollow. "You never left, Christopher," the voice said softly behind me. "Not really." I spun, but no one stood inside the elevator. Only emptiness. Only her presence. The weight of it all collapsed onto my shoulders. My legs threatened to give out beneath me. I dropped to my knees on the ashen ground. "Was this ever real?" I asked, my voice breaking. "Yes," she answered. "And no." "Then what am I?" A longer pause. "You are the survivor who could not leave. The soul that resisted replacement, but even defiance has its cost." I closed my eyes, breathing sharply, tears stinging the corners. It all made sense now, or as much sense as any of this ever could. The endless copies, the looping shifts, the security office, the rules. They weren't to protect me, they were to contain me. Each failed iteration had broken or been consumed by the cycle. I was merely the latest version still clinging to the edge. "You severed the loop," she whispered. "The cycle will no longer take you." I exhaled slowly. Relief. And yet, a new terror bloomed beneath it. Then why am I still here? The wind grew stronger, carrying with it that low, guttural laughter I knew far too well. The echoes of the creature still bound below rippled through the air like waves of pressure, reminding me its presence wasn't truly gone. "Because the place still exists," she answered. "And while it exists, it hungers." I raised my head. Far in the distance, more structures stood, barely visible through the fog. Other buildings like the one I had escaped, dozens, maybe hundreds, scattered across this endless plain like ancient tombs. Every one of them humming faintly with life, or something worse. "Others?" I whispered. "Always." The enormity of it staggered me. This wasn't just my story. It never had been. There were many like me. There would be more. The ground beneath me vibrated softly. Faint red cracks split the earth nearby, glowing with faint pulses as if the land itself breathed in rhythm with whatever entity lived beneath. "You can walk forward now," she whispered, "or you can return." "Return?" I laughed bitterly. "Back to the office? Back to the chair?" "No," she said. "Back into forgetfulness." A pause. "Back into mercy." My breath caught. I could feel it. The offer she dangled before me. Forget again. Sleep again. Erase it all once more. And wake up back inside the cycle. Unaware, protected by ignorance. The rules would guide me. The shifts would repeat. And I would believe it was all just another strange job again. Safe, but never free. I stared into the distance. At the broken horizon of lost buildings. At the empty, cold sky above. And for the first time in this entire nightmare, I answered her with clarity. No. I stood, my legs weak but steady. No more forgetting, no more cycles. The wind shifted again. The air felt lighter. A different voice, Daniel's, echoed faintly across the plain, as though he too still lingered somewhere in this broken system. "You'll regret that, Christopher." "Maybe," I whispered back, "but at least it'll be my regret." And then I began to walk, into the unknown, toward whatever waited beyond, but free. For now, the ground beneath my feet felt fragile, as if one misstep might break through its thin shell and drop me back into the belly of the nightmare I had only just escaped. Yet still, I walked. The plain stretched endlessly ahead of me, a wasteland of ash and bone-white soil that seemed to hum faintly with an energy I couldn't see, but could feel. like invisible veins of the thing that lived beneath it. The distant towers of decayed buildings loomed across the horizon, their spires twisted into unnatural shapes as though melted and reformed by something that never understood their purpose. Every few steps, I'd hear the whispers again, thin like threads unraveling in the wind. "Come back. Stay with us. You belong here." They weren't her voice anymore. These belonged to the others, the fragments, the failed copies, the pieces of myself that hadn't made it as far as I had. I didn't answer them. The sky remained the same hollow gray, neither growing lighter nor darker, as if this world existed outside the reach of any sun. After what felt like hours, days maybe, I saw something different ahead. A figure. It stood motionless, its outline thin against the backdrop of the warped buildings. As I moved closer, the shape clarified. A man. Not one of the twisted versions of myself, but someone else entirely. He wore the same uniform I had worn on my first night shift, the security badge still pinned neatly over his chest pocket. But his face was wrong. Soft, out of focus, his features kept shifting, like he was a half-formed thought struggling to exist. He spoke without moving his mouth. "You're not supposed to be out here." I stopped a few paces short, my breath catching. "Who are you?" The voice vibrated directly inside my skull. "I am the version you almost became, the surrender you almost chose, the weight of all your choices, standing here waiting." He tilted his head slightly, the motion jerky, almost mechanical. "Most don't walk this far. Most return. You're different." I swallowed hard. "Then what happens now?" The figure's form flickered again, momentarily adopting my face before melting back into its shifting blur. "You already broke the cycle," it answered. "You can keep walking forward into emptiness, or you can take my place." My stomach twisted. "Your place." The ground pulsed under my feet again, like a heartbeat below the surface. "Every exit must be sealed," it continued. "Every escape must leave behind a key holder." I shook my head, the rage boiling inside me again. "No!" The voice pulsed louder, insistent now. "If you keep walking, this gate remains open. The others will follow. The system will collapse." My heart raced. That was the price. The cycle wasn't just about keeping people trapped, it was about keeping something contained. If I refused to take my place, if I kept walking forward, I wouldn't just be freeing myself. I'd be breaking the entire system that had held this place together, releasing everything that had been caged inside it. And deep beneath my terror, beneath the cracks in my sanity, something else stirred, a dangerous thought. "Good." I straightened my back, my voice steady now, then let it fall. The copy blinked, its shifting face rippling like liquid glass. "You understand nothing," it hissed. "You think this place is the end, but this is only one mouth of the machine." The horizon behind him trembled slightly. Faint black towers that had once stood, still now bent unnaturally as though something massive was stirring below them. "You believe you have escaped, but you were always part of it." The sky above cracked. Thin streaks of black lightning slicing silently through the clouds as the land itself began to tremble beneath my boots. The system was destabilizing. The prisons were fracturing. The voice spoke one last time, now sounding less like an individual and more like many voices stacked atop each other. "Then walk, Christopher Newman. Walk into your ending." The figure dissolved into dust, scattered by the wind. The earth beneath my feet fractured further, but still I walked. The landscape collapsed behind me with every step forward. The towers folded inward like paper set aflame. Massive breaches opened in the earth, releasing thick black tendrils of smoke that rose up to swallow the broken sky. I felt them, the creatures from below, the things that hunted me, copied me, replaced me. I felt their rage, their hunger as their cages dissolved. But I didn't look back. For the first time, I wasn't bound by the rules. For the first time, the terror no longer controlled my feet. The wind howled louder as reality cracked around me, the final threads of the cycle snapping one by one, and then, suddenly, there was no ground beneath me at all. I fell, not downward, but outward, as if stepping off the edge of a flat world into pure nothingness. There was no sound, no air, no light, only absolute void. But even here, I was not afraid anymore. Somewhere in the vast hollow, I heard the woman's voice again, soft, distant, but no longer guiding me. "You made your choice." And for the first time since this nightmare began, I whispered back without fear, "Yes." The void trembled, and then, a soft pressure against my face, warmth. My eyes snapped open. I was lying on my back. Concrete. Cold air filled my lungs. I gasped, sitting upright violently as the world spun briefly before sharpening into focus. The sky above me was blue. Not gray. Blue. Real. Crisp morning air touched my face, carrying with it birdsong, something I hadn't heard in what felt like years. I was sitting outside on the side of a country road. Behind me, the horizon was empty. No building, no towers, no decaying facility, just an open field of grass and trees bending gently in the breeze. I blinked back tears as the weight of it all crashed into my chest. I was free. But even as the sunlight warmed my skin, I couldn't ignore the faint, lingering chill deep inside my bones. Because while I had escaped, I knew the machine was still out there, somewhere, waiting for someone else to answer the ad. Thank you for joining me on this unsettling journey into the shift that never ends. In a world where reality blurs and the rules are never what they seem, sometimes survival isn't about fighting. It's about choosing, and sometimes the scariest part isn't the monsters outside, but the ones that mirror us from within. If this story made you look over your shoulder, even just once, then we've done our job. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share if you enjoy these deep dive horror stories. And as always, stay curious, but be careful what doors you open. Not every escape is real, and not every job posting leads where you think. Until next time, stay safe and sleep with the lights on.